Cory Sparks, Reverend Cory Sparks, former pastor of St. Mark's in the French Quarter, and also a historian who has worked on questions of memory. So it is a privilege to be here as moderator for this session. We had a wonderful panel last night. I know that Mr. Batson wants to talk about that panel in just a moment, but as we begin this day filled with conversation about the upstairs lounge fire and its legacy, we will have a panel of folks who can get us to this conversation, commemorating the upstairs lounge throughout the decades. And for me, last night, as we were there at the historic New Orleans collection, I thought about 50 years ago when the media, when the church, when city government refused to acknowledge this tragedy or honor the dignity of the victims. And I thought how far we've come to have the president of the city council there, J.P. Morrell, to have the historic New Orleans collection talk about this New Orleans story was powerful. These are the folks who can help us learn how we moved from a place where this was a disaster, a tragedy, a nightmare that was not to be recognized, to a place where it is commemorated, honored, remembered, and seen as part of a battle for LGBT inclusion in our society. So I will begin with the introductions quickly. Robert Batson knows that history well. Just received an award for LGBT plus archives in honor of Stuart Butler and Alfred Doolittle. I know has received a Trailblazer Award from No Age. Led the first tours of gay heritage in the French Quarter, and that's only beginning his biography. He knows this, and I know he also wants to speak to the experience last night. Reverend Dexter Brecht is leader of congregational development for the Metropolitan Community Church now, and is also a former pastor of the Metropolitan Community Church here in New Orleans, a successor to Bill Larson, and responsible for the commemorations at the 25th and 30th anniversaries, and for that plaque being there at the corner of Charters in Iberville. And then Reverend Carole Winn, a trailblazer as well, a trailblazer for women in ministry in the Louisiana Conference of the United Methodist Church, one of the first women ordained in this conference, and then also the first female district superintendent of that church. And for that, we're grateful. But she was there at the 30th anniversary, and also she was there at the first public memorial for the victims. She was there, and we'll talk about that memory. And then someone who is continuing this commemoration work year after year. And Tim and the Leathermen own that work since 2019 or so. And they are going to be steering our worship service in part this afternoon, our memorial service, and the second line, and all of our work to remember those who have died, which is, of course, central to why we're here. And then we conclude here with Professor Robert Linne, an education and cultural studies professor from Adelphi in New York City. We had some good times talking about Adelphi. He is an expert on the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, that fire which killed, I believe, 146 in 1911, and is responsible for many of the occupational safety protocols that we take for granted today. So how do we remember after all those who were affected by the fire directly have died? How do we look forward into the future, and what are some lessons that we can learn about that commemoration? So with that said, I'm going to begin. We are going to have a conversation as we go through. It's just the most natural thing in the world to be sitting around a couple of high boys being stared at by people. So, what could go wrong, right? But we'll have fun with this as we remember, as we commemorate. And Mr. Batson, you wanted to share about your experience last night.
Was there anybody here this morning that was not there last night? I just want to tell you something that was remarkable. As a writer, I know what it's like to put an effort into writing, particularly writing a book. And all three of the writers last night have produced full-length books, and that involved years of their life. And usually, I think with anything, but there's a great competitive feeling that one finds in almost any field. And as wonderful as it was hearing from these three writers, what I was left with was just such a feeling of gratitude that these three writers not only were so civil to each other, but genuinely affectionate. And Johnny, Clay, thank you so much to the writers are here this morning. Because and I know our history is in good hands when we have people of not only such talent, but also of such good hearts. Thank you.
That's a critical point. Well, we'll begin with you. Beyond that point, talk about those early days of commemorating the upstairs lounge fire and your experience of it. You wrote some of the first drafts of gay history in this city, and would love to hear about where we were before we talk about where we're at right now.
I'd like to give just a little bit of context for the fire, because nothing in history exists in isolation. The world of gay New Orleans before the fire is difficult for young people to imagine today. And if you want to know really how terrible it was for most people in the mid-20th century, read Clay's book and Bobby Fiesler's book, because they have researched and documented what that was like. Trying to find out what was our history, how were we before we were really any kind of community. It really began with social life. Before there was, people kid me about, I call it the civic infrastructure of our community, which it is, all these wonderful organizations that make it a community. First were the social lives. The first organized social event that is still going on today was started in 1949, and it was called, well, then it was called something else, but now it's called the Fat Monday Luncheon. And it's still in our nose now since 1949. The oldest organization was called the Steamboat Club, still with us today, from 1953. And then in 1962, a group of women formed a similar social club. Steamboat was they gave parties because people were socializing. Most people were not brave enough even to go to the bars. So in 1962, a group of women created the Gourmet Club, and it was a wonderful idea. They had 12 couples, and each couple would give a dinner party 1 month of the year. But our dear beloved Betty Caldwell told me that as couples split up, no one wanted to give up membership in the Gourmet Club.
It's part of the divorce proceeding.
No one wanted to give it up. So she said, so we grew like an amoeba. We just kept expanding with that. What next came about is the modern gay bars. If you're going to look at gay American history of the 20th century, you have to factor in Prohibition. Because from 1920 to 1933, there were no legal bars.
Let's not give that much context.
but that was the next step in socialization. Something remarkable did happen in 1970. A group of kind of crazy radical hippies announced the formation of the Gay Liberation Front of New Orleans, which was a term being used in other cities. And the GLF, they were out in public. They demonstrated in front of City Hall, protesting what was the major day-to-day problem, which was police abuse with that. And what had precipitated this was there were arrests, entrapments in Cabrini Park. But bar raids and entrapments were what life was like, the fear of that. Unfortunately, the GLF did not last. So when we got to the fire a few years later, all that was really left of the GLF was MCC. The Metropolitan Community Church congregation here in New Orleans came out of the GLF, and there was an organization at Tulane University of students. So when we got to the fire, as Bobby was saying last night, there really was no local visible leadership. There was no one to meet with the press and do all of that, and that's why we're so grateful to Troy Perry, who came and did that for us. Out of the fire, not a great deal happened right away. Some people say the fire was the beginning of our community. It did motivate a few people, but it did not bring about the massive participation. That happened 4 years later in 1977, for which we have to thank Mrs. Bob Green, who you perhaps know by her professional name, Anita Bryant. Anita Bryant was leading the effort to get rid of the anti-discrimination ordinance in Miami, and they did succeed in overturning it on June 7th. But it had already been set that she was contracted to perform with the New Orleans Summer Pops Orchestra, and that was going to be her first public performance after the overturn in Miami. And so a group of people, a small group of people, grandly announced there would be a rally and a protest. And amazingly, we think about 5,000 people showed up in Jackson Square, which was astonishing. There's a very distinguished lady in our community, an elderly lady, who once said to me, "My dear, in my age, we didn't have closets."
That's such a great New Orleans line.
We had armoires. So I like to think of that as coming out of the armoires and into the bright light of day.
Those beautiful framing notions. And it was many years before the commemoration began to take life in anything close to what we are going to see today. And so I will go. You mentioned the MCC as critical, Metropolitan Community Church, and its founder, Reverend Troy Perry. Reverend Dexter Brecht, you played a critical role in this commemoration. So to hear from you about your experiences in the 90s.
First of all, I want to say thank you to the organizers of this conference and all the wonderful things that are planned or have already happened. And I count it as privilege to be back here in the city that I called home for so long. I approach my remembrance around the fire from an MCC perspective. I arrived in New Orleans in 1994 to assume my very first pastorate, eager and naive. I had grown up at the opposite end of the Mississippi, and let me tell you, Minnesota and Iowa are a place far, far away. And it was a long, long time ago. But because I was eager to really be the kind of spiritual leader that I felt called to be and emulate MCC's practices, I read Reverend Elder Troy's book called Don't Be Afraid Anymore. And in that book, there's a chapter dedicated to incidences around the country of MCCs experiencing vandalism and or hate crimes before they were called hate crimes. And there were a number of prominent churches in the fellowship at that time that had experienced it. The Mother Church in Los Angeles was burned. The place that was used by MCC in Atlanta was burned because of its being the home of a spiritual community such as MCC. But once I had read that book, I really felt a sense of spiritual calling to make sure that, because I was living in this city where this terrible incident had happened and part of this movement, and had in my congregation one of the survivors of the fire, Deacon Courtney Craighead, that I needed to do something to help ensure that this incident was not going to be forgotten, but also that the people that had been directly injured were honored, held up, and so that we could learn as a community from the event so that it was less likely to ever happen again. So when it came time approaching what would have been the 25th anniversary of the fire, I preached a sermon around how this was an important event for MCC, for New Orleans, and part of the instigation of the LGBT movement across the country. And it was sort of okay received. But some of the folks did resonate with that concept, and someone spoke to a reporter from the Times-Picayune named Bruce Nolan, and he came and he interviewed me, and all of a sudden this naive pastor of this small MCC congregation had a half-page article in the Times-Picayune and for all of New Orleans to read. And from that point on, things just started happening around how can we mark this 25th anniversary of this event. And I worked closely with Tony Pisani, who some of you knew and remember well. Also, she involved Rip Nakan, the owner of Ambush magazine. Roberts was involved, and at another hotel whose name shall not be mentioned, in this place, we called together a panel of what we thought were spiritual or community leaders to speak, and the night came. Two relatives of one of the victims showed up quite unexpectedly at that event for the first time to acknowledge their uncle. And from that hotel, for the first time, the city demonstrated that this was something that should be remembered as well. And City Councilman Troy Carter, who represented the French Quarter on the City Council, led the second line to the site where the fire happened. There are all sorts of other folks that I'm not going to take up all the time to mention specifically by name, but in some way promoted and or helped to make that event happen. And one of the things that happened at the 25th remembrance of the fire was that a fund was established, a commemorative fund. And from that fund, over the next couple years, we waited, and you know how fast things happen in New Orleans, right? So we gathered support, and when it came time for the observance of the 30th anniversary of the fire, another small group of us came together. Jack Carole is actually the person that designed that plaque. He was the director of the LGBT plus community center here in New Orleans at the time. And Larry Bagneris, who was one of the first liaisons for the city representing the LGBTQ community, became involved. We approached the owner of the building to place the plaque, and we were flatly denied the opportunity to place the plaque on the building. Larry said not to worry. He worked directly with the city streets department and got all of the permitting necessary, and that's why the plaque is in the sidewalk outside what would have been the entrance to the bar. If you've never been, I really want to encourage you to take a journey there to take a look at the plaque, because it lists some specific information, but the name of every single person that was a victim of that fire, along with a remembrance of every one of those that remain to this day unidentified, are represented on that plaque. And at the gathering in conjunction with that 30th anniversary, the fire chief, who had made some disparaging remarks at that first, after the incident occurred, apologized to the community. And that's my perspective. And I just want to say that I'm glad I got into good trouble.
All right.
Thank you, Congressman.
And I noticed that Bobby Fiesler has come into the room as well. We recognized Clayton and Johnny earlier, so good to see you here. Thanks for all that you've done. It strikes me that you and the plaque have helped to make this upstairs lounge fire official in the view of first the New Orleans community with the plaque, and then with a broader national community. Saw a piece with you interviewed in The Nation and Nation Online. So those pieces are important to this commemoration as we tell the stories of these survivors. As we mention the stories of the survivors, Reverend Brecht, I do want to tell everyone that the crew of Vexia is here, particularly Renata Weatherspoon there in a white t-shirt. At each of our panels and throughout the day, we will have representatives of the crew. Ms. Weatherspoon is a board-certified psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner, and if you find yourself in need of someone with whom to speak, she's there for you. And we recognize this is not just about a fight for LGBT equality. This is about a tragedy that claimed the lives of 32 precious people. So with that, I turn aside. I'm not passing the mic any further down, knowing that there is a preacher on that table. Reverend Carole Cotton Winn, you were there at that first memorial service and then also at the 30th. So we'd love to hear your experience.
Well, when I remember whenever you would call, or someone would call and say, now, Reverend Winn, would you come and be present? And I would always say, okay, so what time do you want me to be there? Because there was never any question in my mind as to whether or not I was going to be there. I just needed to know what time I needed to be there. So that, because the whole event was so powerful and so meaningful that we wanted it to be caressed. We wanted it to be caressed in the arms of people that loved and were loved and were remembered. And I think that's what each time we met, we would always say, lest we forget. We come together again. And just like the way you all have come, all of us have come today, we're the people that hold the story. And the beauty of your presence just speaks volumes. And it's what we take home with us. that we're part of something that we will never forget. And we are always going to be available, to speak the truth about what happened and to be present to what happened. We won't turn it back. We won't turn it back.
The 45th anniversary at St. Mark's, you spoke about the first memorial service, and you mentioned it earlier today when you arrived, that there was this question, are we going to go out the front doors of the church or not? There were cameras there. This was
That's
a time
right. That's
when
right.
the armoire was real, right, Mr. Batson?
The armoire was very real.
The armoire was very real. So if you could talk about that just a moment and how that speaks to what you just shared.
It was, because it was all very real. And what I also remember was that our bishop of the Louisiana Conference at the time was present, sat in the balcony, but stayed through the whole morning, the whole day, and then continued, out the front door, and so. I never dawned on me, why wouldn't we go out the front door? Of course we're going to go out the front door, and to my knowledge, nearly everyone walked out the front door. It was no longer an issue, and thank God for that.
Yes.
We could be who we are, and we could celebrate it, and for that we will always be grateful. No regrets.
A good reminder about Bishop Finus Crutchfield.
And that Finus Crutchfield, the bishop was there. And so, and I take it that, it was at his, willingness to be there. It was no problem.
When you wrote a powerful message that I will mention at some point in a panel on the spiritual legacy of the fire, that is part of the spiritual legacy, where he was criticized for being there at this memorial service. He said if there's any place that needs healing and reconciliation, it was that place at that time, that church, and I couldn't be anywhere else.
That's right.
And that was a powerful word. Well, Tim, as I said, the Crescent City Leathermen have come to mark this on an annual basis since 2019, and just to share why it is so important to the Leathermen and to you.
For me personally, when I moved here in 2016, I had never heard about the fire, which kind of astonished me, as big as an event as it was. We were in a board meeting in the end of December, the year before that, and one of our board members had read Bobby Fieser's book, and he brought it up to the board, and we all read the book and realized just how big of an event it was. And the year before that, the group that was doing the services announced that was probably going to be their last year they would be able to do it. So as a board, they decided to pick up the service and continue that, and every year we have done a candlelight vigil at the site. The first year was a small vigil. It was during the day. They had construction at the site. There was a dumpster there. There was probably about 20 people that gathered in the rain. And then each year, as we've done it, it has gotten a larger crowd every year. Rain or shine, they're there. So the biggest idea for us is to make sure that the younger generation learns about it and it's not forgotten, especially with today's culture where we're canceling history. We don't want that to happen again, because they already tried to cancel it once.
That's right.
We don't want it to be canceled again. So that's the main reason why we continue it every year.
That's a wonderful transition to Professor Linne and the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire and your work with your colleagues on continuing that story long after those who were victims have been forgotten in some way as individuals. So we'd love to hear about your experiences. We look forward past the year 50 to 175. Some of us will not be here for the centennial, I think. I'm going to try. I'll go on record. But Professor Linne, some thoughts on what lessons you've learned from working with other groups, too, that are remembering.
Thank you. Yes, I've been working on public commemorations, and education around the Triangle Factory Fire for coming up on 20 years now. And we've been able to form some networks and collaborations with other groups working on memory work and public commemoration. We've worked with the Lowell strikes, the Bread and Roses strikes. I've been to West Virginia to work with some of the miners' tragedies. There was a 100-year anniversary of the West Virginia mine wars where many miners were killed. And I've started to become more interested in, what makes for a public commemoration, a public commemoration that's effective and respectful at the same time, because you have to be intentional in many ways. So maybe I just want to share, so I'm noticing a lot of patterns. Sometimes it's uncanny, some of the similarities across the country in these events, the oppression of history, and lately people trying to, no, we're going to uncover that history. It's happening in several places so I think with the work that you're doing, you can feel that it's connected to other people around the country doing this kind of work. I'll share some of the similarities that I've seen. I've only been here for a day, and I'm already inspired with the work, and I just want to share some of the patterns that I see that may bring this work to context. One of the first things we talk about with the Triangle Fire Coalition is say their names. We always go back to the names, and because their dignity was lost in many ways, and they were forgotten. And in history books, we often say 146 people died in the Triangle Fire. Or I learned a little about the upstairs lounge, and I knew this many people died, and I was upset about it, and I wanted to learn about it. And it's the same pattern that happens over and over again. I read the book Tinderbox that was discussed last night, and it went beyond the names, and the stories were told, and their humanity was given back to them. I mean, very specific stories that will stay with me forever. The two Mitchell brothers staying at the movie theater, watching movie after movie, waiting for their father to come home. The Stephen Duplantis, the military person who had to drive all the way back to San Antonio after experiencing such trauma, and he couldn't mourn. He couldn't talk to anybody where he went. That really will stick with me. So the stories, the names are important to always remember to go back to that and not to make them just victims in a vague kind of way. I was happy to hear last night that the stories the people are still working on the research. I do think that we can't ever think the story has been told. I think you will find, if you continue working on this, a lot more ripples you'll discover. I'm going to share one with you. I was working with HBO, did a film on the Triangle Factory fire, and they wanted photos from all of the victims that were going to be discussed. And one family had just such a compelling, deep story. They couldn't find a photo, and they were very upset. And this was like for months of the filming, and they couldn't find a photo. And at the last minute, somebody said, well, what about Uncle Leo's wallet? That's in the keepsake box. So Uncle Leo, his sister had died in the fire in 1911, and he had died in the late 70s. And somebody kept his wallet, and he didn't talk about the fire much. Other family members were, so people weren't sure if it was a big part of his life. They looked in the wallet, and he had like his Social Security card, his union card, and a picture of his sister that he had kept for decades and decades. And then so the family was able to put the pieces together about what kind of trauma he went through and more about him. And just the family became much more aware of so many stories. I'm interested in the second line today. I just want to share that around the country, another pattern that we see is the arts are so important in these commemorations and keeping doing the memory work. With the Triangle Fire, we chalk the names of each person at the stoop where they lived each year, and I go sometimes with 7th grade classes, and they become public teachers out on the street. People are saying, "Why are you chalking my stoop?" And the kids tell the story. So we found that people they've learned the story, they have this grief, this anger, and they want to do something with it. So to have some art, something for them to be involved with. We do have a memorial. It's taken us a long time, but a memorial is finally being built. It's being unveiled October 11th. Please come visit. Or anytime if you want to come to New York, email me and we'll have somebody give you a tour. But the memorial, the women were falling from the 6th floor So we have a stainless steel ribbon coming down to the street. And what we did is we got the community together. Everybody brought a piece of material that was important to them. I brought my father's U.S. Postal Service patch, and we sewed a 6-floor ribbon. And then that's been cast in stainless steel. It's going to be a very compelling monument. So when you are in New York, please see it.
What's the address?
It is right off of Washington Square Park, the corner of Washington Place and Green. So one more thing I want to say is that sometimes, we would talk about their spirit is still with us, or, they're still with us. And it would be kind of vague, and maybe there wouldn't be action behind that. And so we've learned that there is a usable past and that it can still motivate people, and it does. And a couple of examples, people from Bangladesh contacted us. They learned about the Triangle Factory fire, and it inspired them to work for their rights. There's been horrific conditions in Bangladesh in the factories there, people burning up as well. So you never know what your work is going to do, who it might affect. I was in West Virginia, and so many of the younger mine workers, the story of their grandparents was suppressed, and how that they were treated. And so now that the history's come back through books, much like Tinderbox or the Triangle Factory fire books, people started to learn their history, and they became empowered, and they felt bravery. Like, wow, my grandfather stood up for our family back then, even though they were shooting at him. So a few years ago, they wear the red bandanas. When I went there, I didn't know, but that's how we got the term redneck. The miners in Appalachia would wear red bandanas on their necks so their friends wouldn't shoot at them when the police were shooting at them. So now the teachers went on strike. They were really beat down. They went on strike. They wore their red bandanas because they learned the history, and they were able to come together after generations of learning the story. So from being here, I grew up in Texas, and I've wrestled all the decades about how in your face do you get with politics? And I moved to New York, and I've learned you can get very much in people's faces with politics. So I am just so inspired by the people who went out the front door. So that's going to be kind of one of my mantras, like, okay, I'm going to go out the front door. So thank you for involving me.
Thank you so much. And a challenge from Reverend Perry to the community and to that's my phone, Mr. Batson. I'll keep it a wary eye, I was a pastor. My first Sunday at St. Mark's on Rampart Street, my phone was stolen. So ever since then, I keep an eye. So it is. But I wanted to leave some time for conversation, then some time for questions. So I'm sure you have questions. Questions, not comments. That was one of the things last night. Questions. But I wanted to talk about memory. And you mentioned the term usable past, which is a term that's often been referred to in memory work by historians. Of course, we're here in New Orleans, and I think we need to talk about those monuments that have been taken down. I'm wearing a tie, intentionally wearing a tie. It's Jackson Square with Andrew Jackson, who's not yet been taken down for his work to kill Native Americans. In addition to being a president, he has that legacy. But this question of why we have monuments, why we have a plaque to our conversation at this very moment this morning, you mentioned, Reverend Brecht, that this was critical to the identity of your congregation, a congregation that included a survivor. You mentioned this concept of a past and how it connects, I think throughout this we've heard, how this tragedy connects to work for full inclusion of LGBT plus people. And those questions of memory connect to ritual, which is a fancy word for what you do when you do a candlelight vigil. So I'd love to hear from y'all as we go into conversation. I know there are only 2 mics about memory, the memory of this tragedy and its power in your life, and to reflect in any way, either on ritual and the work that we're doing, as Reverend Winn pointed out, the work we're doing just by showing up on a Saturday morning, to reflect on those. Anyone who'd like to chime in?
I would just like to say it's so important, as everyone is saying, to keep our history. And you're going to be noticing the woman with the camera over here, whose name is Valda Lewis. And Valda is one of our great keepers of our history. For a number of years, she produced a show on Access Television, which was historic. And it was a monthly show of gay news. And Valda is living in Ohio, or some such place, that I've heard of. But we miss her, and thank you, Valda, for what you have done.
Thank you for that. Other thoughts on the memory of this event?
I'll just add a personal, vivid memory for me. Goes along with the idea of spiritual embodiment. And leaving the hotel room where we had gathered for the 25th and actually being in the street, walking along with individuals who had relatives that were survivors, knowing we were being led by the first time by an official of the city, there was a sense of spirit that was present there for me as we made our way to where this horrific event occurred, and seeing in people's eyes the eagerness to know what this was all about was really powerful for me. But also just that being shoulder to shoulder, knowing I was part of a people that would not give up. This memory was really impactful for me.
I was going to just add one memory that I have of the event was when we were leaving to go to see the plaque for the first time. And so we've gone out the front door and we're going to take a right. But of course there was always we always had music around us at all times. And so when we hit the streets, the music started. And at that point, we weren't just walking, we were doing it. We were just doing it up and down that street. I mean, it was a wonderful moment because we could just be free to be. We were so proud to know that the plaque was going to be there, and that it just gave us such joy. Hey, we're the people. This is our place, and that corner is our corner, and we're going to march there. We're going to love there, and we're going to remember. Lest we forget. We're the people. Lest we forget.
As far as the memory, every year I always have at least 2 or 3, someone from the younger generation ask me, why do we do this every year? They don't view it as a hate crime because it was from someone inside the community. And I always bring back to them, I said, the hate crime happened afterwards. It was how the city responded, how the churches responded, and how the press responded. And in that conversation, I open their eyes and they start understanding why we do it every year. And that's where that memory comes in. It's very important to continue that every year because some of them don't see it as a hate crime until you bring up the history behind it.
Last night I was reading about Stuart Butler, of course, a leader of the community who left the upstairs lounge shortly before the fire because his lover, Alfred, said, I don't have a good feeling. And so they went to another bar. But the next day, we mentioned the gentleman had to drive to San Antonio and pretend as if nothing had happened. The next day, he was here in New Orleans, and his co-workers were making fun of the victims, joking about mass death. And that would not have happened if they were straight people. Point blank, no conversation. So thank you for sharing that. Any other thoughts, memories? Okay. We certainly can go to questions now. I see you first, so in the rear of the cap.
Thank you. So, it's a little bit of a long question, but I'll be as quick as possible.
Okay.
Considering that in media and politics, right-wing conservative Christians have seemingly cornered the market of religious values with their disgusting villainizing statements that often become front-page news on LGBTQ websites, why is it that when progressive Christians and voices send out these boring press releases, they get ignored and lost in the noise? And what can we do to change that? Do we need to start making extreme statements and displays of our own?
Thank you for that question. Anyone want to respond? I want to respond, but I'm the moderator. I will say that the communications director for the Louisiana Conference of the Young Methodist Church is here and is going to make a post that's not boring, but I defer to a great spiritual leader who is on the panel, who are on the panel, to talk about that from the MCC perspective, and you're still active, of course, in our retired United Methodist leader. So I'm going to hand it to Reverend Brecht because he's closer.
I want to say, can you repeat the question, but I won't.
Why can't we get pressed?
No. I think about Michelle Obama in her response during the last election cycle when she said, when they go low, we go high. And I think it's imperative for us as a community not to go low. We are called, I believe, to keep our dignity in our responses and to gain our strength from one another, as opposed to those sorts of outside voices or pressures from external organizations, et cetera, that try to bait us to go low. And that I believe, if we are persistent in maintaining that sort of attitude and our spiritual integrity, that we will prevail, because something that hasn't been mentioned yet today is united we stand. Yes. United we stand, and which was the song that was sung at the bar at closing time, every time they closed, and that we continue to maintain the tradition, the ritual of singing at each of the memorial services. United we stand.
Reverend Winn?
It's been so well said. I'm not sure I can add anything to it, but it just warms my heart, you know. And when it warms my heart, it means that yes, I say yes, and I say welcome. You know, that we are together in this.
We are together. I was at an event for Pride at Longview House and Gardens. I mentioned Longview just a moment ago to you, Dr. Linne. And there were protesters of this family day, family equality day at Longview, where children were there. It was evidently, Reverend Brecht, you're a church planner, a church development person, and I'm a former recovering church development and plant person. It was evidently a church planning strategy. The thought was, oh, I know, let's go protest children who are celebrating equality and LGBT inclusion. That's the way we're going to grow our church. And rather than going low, the executive director and board of the organization said, no, don't engage these folks. We're united. We're going to go have a lovely summer day where a performer who's one of the great leaders of the gay community here, Vanessa, is going to sing songs for children. And as a last thought, and this is part of the memory, when Vanessa finished, I think one of the first songs, Vanessa said, whose grandfather, by the way, said, there, and now, looking at the children, now you're all gay. thought it was perfect. And then Vanessa said, "See how silly that sounds?" And when we left the fest, I didn't stay till the very end. When we left, there were no protesters there because there was no room for that hate. But to your very good question, I will say that, in my opinion, we need to do a better job of ensuring that the dignity of these victims is protected at the same time. And that sometimes requires a bit of fierceness, and not just by people from the LGBT community, but by allies, people who claim to be allies, and to stand up for a religious voice. And that's a conversation I'd love to have with you personally, because it's very important to me. Okay, and I see a hand. I think I had a hand here first, and then I'll go back to you. Yes.
I just was thinking about how this memorial, we had a memorial at St. George's Episcopal Church. And Father Bill Richardson, who was about this tall, was standing out there when they came into the church. He was doing it partly for the reverend that was involved. Yes. And then we had Richard Easterling, who also had collected some of the history. And we've had memorial services every year at St. George's. It has changed our church considerably. And it has changed the Episcopal diocese. Our bishop, who is now female,
Bishop Shannon Duckworth, yes.
After 126 years, we finally have one. Was in the parade.
I love you, Penny, but a question.
The question is just how, when we do care, when we do talk, it changes what happens afterwards. It's not a question, it was a comment.
It is. Well, but it's something we can rip off, because that's part of the work we do is talking about it. And all of us talking about it, not just on June 24th, but on the 25th, my birthday, by the way, and beyond. So any thoughts on that about talking and the power of talking? I think there's a spiritual dimension.
Having a legacy, having Father Richardson stand up and say what Jesus has done, that's what we have to do. And that's what he did. And he stood up to his bishop at the time.
Yes.
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 And now our bishop is with us. And I think it was a comment. I'm sorry.
It's okay. Okay. Any other thoughts on that point, which is a very good one? And remembering Father Richardson is central. Yes. And then I'll get back to you, and I'll probably wrap us up. Go ahead.
I was unable to attend the function at HNOC last night, so I don't know if this artifact was on display, but there's an incredibly powerful artifact in their collection. It is a statue of David from the upstairs lounge. And it's wonderful for a lot of reasons. It's an accurate version. It has a certain campy element to it, but what makes it so super powerful, it's blackened from the ash of the fire. So if you ever get the opportunity to see this very, very moving artifact, don't miss it.
Of course, we know the statue of David is gay, right? That's been well established. Any thoughts, Roberts? You were really...
No, probably more questions.
We do have a question in the very back, and then to Brett, if we can. Very back, as I kept saying, I would call on you. Yes.
Hello. I was just wondering, yesterday there was a really interesting comment that was asked during the open panel. And it was this idea that we shouldn't think of this as LGBTQ history, but we should think of this as human history. And what was interesting was the reactions of the audience about, like, what do we lose if we do that, or what do we gain? And I'm a professor of rhetoric, so I don't think it's an either or, I think it's an either and, right? Like, they're two different rhetorical strategies. And I was wondering what the panel thought in terms of navigating those strategies, like framing it as human history and not a minority history, and then framing it as a specific minority history. I was just wondering if you could talk about, in memory work, what are the pros and cons or the struggles of navigating those two strategies?
I'm in absolute agreement that it's on. Okay. I'm in absolute agreement that it is a both and it is imperative that as part of our identity as a people, that we claim this specifically as part of who we are. However, we would not be, we would not live up to the potential that we have as a community if we didn't acknowledge the allies that we have with us all the time, and we have a prime example of that right here. So it's a queer event. It's a queer memory that must be claimed from my perspective. And isn't it a blessing that we have allies to claim it along with us?
And kind of piggybacking off that, they say they want it to be human history. And it is human history, but it also is queer history. And we have to claim it as that. But you turn that statement back around to them and said, yes, it is human history, but you need to look at it from your side of human history. How did your side respond to this event? And try to get that discussion going with them.
So back to conversation. Brett, I promised.
Yeah, I have a question for Reverend Winn, since you were there. I met with a guy, he came to St. Mark's one day. He just wanted to sit in the sanctuary because he came, but he was afraid to go inside. So he stayed kind of across the street. Can you tell us like the demographics of the people who were there? I mean, like, were they friends of victims? People that were in the community? What was it like inside the church, the people that were there?
Well, what was it like?
I mean, tell me the demographics of who were there.
Well, of course, I'll say the bishop. The bishop was there and present and stayed with it, and even, never got up to leave. It was just always present. And I don't know who else I would claim that was there, but.
I mean, my question though is like,
Were they male, female?
I mean, yeah, the people that came, were they from the gay community? I mean, if all the people that showed up, who were they?
I think principally from the Reverend Winn, the other Reverend John Winn was there.
And I was impressed. It was a broad set. A lot of them were from the Treme community that surrounded, who was still in the closet. And this was a chance to come out, even somewhat anonymously. That was why it was so important that we went out the front door. Yes. We did not want to hide from anybody. And so it was a broad, there were gays, there were lesbians, there were straights, there was interracial. It was a remarkable group. And the minute you walked in, we came in late. And so the crowd had gathered, and I was amazed. I mean, you're talking the 70s. Right. This is the most integrated group I had seen in one place in New Orleans in a long time.
And that tells you something very important. We've hit 11 o'clock, but we want to end on that note. And you sharing that story underscores the importance of the oral history initiative of the LGBT plus archives. Did you want to make an announcement? You are here.
Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, thank you all so much for your amazing stories. And, the theme I kept hearing was sharing a story, passing it on, memory work. And I want to thank, too, some of the people who are already here, like Batson and Valda Lewis, who have done their oral history interviews that are housed jointly with the LGBT plus archive and LSU Library of Special Collections. And so we encourage people, and I see Nancy in the audience who's been a volunteer for us. We're part of a subcommittee with the LGBT archive, and I would like to encourage everybody here who hasn't told a story to come and learn a little bit more about the oral history program. We have a flyer, we have connections to the website, and possibly sign up to have your oral history interview taken. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the mic.
Thank you.